Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Cut Rate Commander, the series in which we take a look at low-price commanders and make budget decks with them. My name is Grazzet and today we'll be looking at the True Giant Monarch, Storvald Frost Giant Jarl. Before we continue, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you like this content and would like me to continue making more videos like this in the future. Also, be sure to stick around until the end of the video to get some more info on upcoming episodes. So with that out of the way, let's start by taking a look at the commander and playstyle. Storvald Frost Giant Jarl is a 7/7 giant with Ward 3 and the following abilities. Other creatures you control have Ward 3. Whenever Storvald enters the battlefield or attacks, choose one or both. Target creature has base power and toughness 7/7 until end of turn. Target creature has base power and toughness 1/1 until end of turn. Fitting for a giant, Storvald is packing a huge CMC and a stat line to match, along with abilities that provide a healthy mix of protection as well as stat manipulation. Looking more in depth into his first ability, a board-wide Ward 3, while not being as good as Hexproof or Shroud for keeping our creatures alive through targeted removal, is still a decent form of protection against said removal, considering that it will usually double and can even quadruple some of the more staple removal spells in our format. Not only will it deter our opponents from targeting our creatures in the first place, but will also force them to be inefficient with their mana if they do decide to target them, making them lose tempo in the process. Moving on to his second ability, pumping one of our creatures to a 7/7 while shrinking an opponent's to a 1/1 allows us to put quite a bit of pressure on our opponents in combat. Since this modifies the creature's base stats, this synergizes particularly well with +1/+1 counters and anthems, both of which our colors have in spades, to bring our creature stats even higher. And on the flip side, shrinking our opponent's creatures, while having the obvious benefit of making them much less useful when blocking, also has the added benefit of making them vulnerable to cards that care about power and toughness if we want to make further use of them. So, we know that Storvald serves as both a source of protection for our board and provides some potent stat manipulation in combat. But we also know that he's a CMC 7 body that at best we may only be able to summon once or twice per game, meaning that we can't rely on him to carry us through the game as he'll usually be absent for the majority of it. That means we'll need to have a deck that benefits from the protection and stat manipulation our commander provides when he does hit the field, but is still capable of operating efficiently even when our commander isn't in play. And what better way to do that than a build that's focused on pumping small evasive bodies with +1/+1 counters. Blue and white have no shortage of very low to the ground bodies that are able to get over blockers with ease, while all three of our colors have a plethora of ways to continually generate +1/+1 counters for creatures as they come into play or stick around on the battlefield. And when our commander finally does come into play, he'll be able to pump our creatures' low base stats into the stratosphere, allowing them to take double-digit chunks out of our opponent's life totals while being untouchable by their blockers. But having such a low-to-the-ground deck has the disadvantage of being vulnerable to having our boards blown out by a well-placed wipe and leaving us with nothing on board or in hand. Luckily for us, however, all our colors offer superb choices of protection to keep our creatures alive and our board states intact, ranging from reactive counter spells, abilities that prevent targeting, and even board wipe protection, ensuring that our creatures stick around to keep growing, only to be protected further when our commander comes online to make removing them that much harder. So let's remind our opponents that you should never underestimate an opponent due to their size, because while our creatures may start off small, they will outgrow and outlast anything our opponents can throw their way, just like the Frost Giant King that leads them. So now that we know a bit more about the commander and playstyle, let's start looking at the deck itself by starting with the creatures. The CMC 1 slot starts us off with some blue evasive bodies in the form of Mist-Cloaked Herald, Slitherblade, and Triton Shorestalker, all being 1/1s that can't be blocked, making them perfect early game drops to grow with counters while always being able to dodge blockers. We also have Goodall Lurker joining us in this slot as another 1/1 that can't be blocked, though this one has Megamorph for a blue, allowing it to generate its own +1/+1 counter should we need it. Some flyers with upside then join us in this slot with Merfolk Windrobber, Siren Stormtamer, and Spectral Sailor. Merfolk Windrobber is a 1/1 flyer that, when it deals combat damage, mills the defending player for 1, and we can sack it to draw a card if our opponent has 8 or more cards in their grave, making it another low-cost evasive body that we can get some card advantage out of if it were to be removed. Siren Stormtamer is another 1/1 flyer that we can pay a blue and sack to counter a spell or ability that targets us or a creature we control, providing us with some cheap protection from targeted removal for our key creatures while still being able to get in for damage itself. Spectral Sailor is yet another 1/1 flyer, this one with flash as well, that we can pay 3 and a blue to draw a card, giving us a mana sink that we can use up any mana we may have kept open to protect our board, and which we can cast on our opponent's turn as a bonus. More flyers are up next with Healer's Hawk and Segovian Angel, both being 1/1s, the former also having lifelink to help pad our life totals, while the latter has Vigilance to serve as a formidable blocker once we've grown it, giving us some additional cheap evasive bodies that have relevant keywords for extra utility. Then we end this lot with Mikaeus the Luminarch, an X creature that comes into play with X +1/+1 counters, and we can tap to either put a +1/+1 counter on him, or to remove a counter from him to put a +1/+1 counter on all our other creatures, making him a superb source of counters that we can drop early to grow, then distribute his counters to our other creatures once we get them on board later. The CMC2 slot then continues with the unblockable bodies with Aether Figment, Invisible Stalker, and Blighted Agent, all 3 being 1/1s that can't be blocked, the first having Kicker for 3 to have it come into play with 2 +1/+1 counters for the bigger body and counter synergy if we cast it later, the second having Hexproof for the built-in protection against targeted removal, and the third having Infect, making it particularly nasty as it grows and working well alongside our proliferation effects. We also have Sihana Ledgewalker joining us as another 1/1 with effectively hexproof that can only be blocked by creatures with flying or reach, giving us another body that we can safely grow without having to worry about targeted removal. Some +1/+1 counter synergies are up next with Grateful Apparition, Thrumming Bird, and Skyship Plunderer. The first 2 being 1/1s that proliferate when they deal combat damage to a player, with Grateful Apparition also proccing off Planeswalker damage, and the last being a 2/1 flyer that gives an additional type of counter to target creature or player when it deals combat damage, giving us a decent suite of creatures that can get in easily for damage and make our other creatures or themselves bigger when they do so. The +1/+1 counter synergies then continue with Merfolk Skydiver and Conclave Mentor. Merfolk Skydiver is a 1/1 flyer that puts a +1/+1 counter on a creature we control when it ETBs, and lets us proliferate by paying 3, a green and a blue, serving as a cheap body to drop early and a mana sink to grow our counters with later. Conclave Mentor is a 2/2 that, whenever a creature we control were to get a +1/+1 counter on it, it would get that amount +1 instead, in addition to gaining us life equal to its power when it dies, usually doubling our creature's counter gain so long as it sticks around, and padding our life totals when it's finally dealt with, especially if we've managed to grow it. Finally, we end this slot with Sakura Tribelder, a 1/1 that we can sack to put a basic land from our deck into play tapped, giving us some staple green land ramp that helps sort out our 3-color mana base. The CMC3 slot then gets us back on the evasive body plan with Guild-Pact Informant, Cold-Eye Selkie, and Linvala Shield of Seagate. Guild-Pact Informant is a 1/1 flyer that proliferates whenever it deals combat damage to a player or planeswalker, giving us another flying source of proliferation to keep our counters growing. Cold-Eye Selkie is another 1/1, this time with Island Walk, that draws us cards equal to the amount of combat damage it deals to a player, serving as a repeatable source of card draw, especially when we grow it, which will usually find a safe player to attack in a 4-player game. Linvala is a 3/3 flyer that we can sack to give our board either hexproof or indestructible until end of turn, making it both a decent evasive body on its own to grow and a means to keep our board intact from targeted removal or wipes respectively. Champion of Lambhold also joins us in this slot, being a 1/1 that gets a +1/+1 counter whenever a creature ETBs under our control and prevents creatures with power less than it from blocking our creatures, serving as an ever-growing threat as we grow our board and making even our utility creatures unblockable as it grows for that extra pressure. Some creatures that help us distribute counters are up next with Good Fortune Unicorn and Plaxcaster Frogling. Good Fortune Unicorn is a 2/2 that has any creature that ETBs under our control come into play with an additional +1/+1 counter, giving us a no-frill source of counter distribution as we summon our creatures throughout the course of the game. Plaxcaster Frogling is a 0/0 with Graph 3, coming into play with 3 +1/+1 counters and giving us the option to move a counter from it to another creature when said creature ETBs, in addition to letting us pay 2 to grant target creature with a +1/+1 counter Shroud until the end of the turn, making it another means to distribute counters to our evasive creatures, which we can then later use to protect them from targeted removal. Finally, we end this slot with Fertilid, a 0/0 that comes into play with 2 +1/+1 counters, and we can pay 1, a green, and remove a counter from it to put a basic land from our deck into play tapped, making it a potent source of land ramp for us that we can get a large amount of value out of if we can keep replenishing its counters. The CMC4 slot is up next, starting us off with some more counter distribution with Forgotten Ancient, Master Biomancer, and Renata Called to the Hunt. Forgotten Ancient is a 0/3 that gains a +1/+1 counter whenever anyone casts a spell, and then we can distribute any number of those counters to any other creatures during our upkeep, potentially serving as a huge source of counters as both we and our opponents cast our spells. Master Biomancer is a 2/4 that has any creature we control ETB with additional +1/+1 counters on it equal to Master Biomancer's power, giving us another ETB source of counter distribution, but this one having the added benefit of giving out even more counters if we're able to make it bigger. Renata is a star 3 whose power is equal to our devotion to green and has each creature we control ETB with an additional +1/+1 counter on it, providing us with further redundancy as another ETB counter production source. Creatures that provide our board with protection are up next with Sporeback Troll and Chalet Voice of Plenty. Sporeback Troll is a 0/0 with Graft 2 that we can pay 1 and a green to regenerate a creature with a +1/+1 counter on it, serving a similar role as Plaxcaster Frogling, but this time being able to protect itself as well as our creatures from board wipes. Chalet is a 3/4 flyer that gives both us and all other creatures we control hexproof, in addition to letting us pay 4 and double green to put a +1/+1 counter on every creature we control, providing us with a decent evasive body, board-wide targeted removal protection, and a mana sink that grows our creatures, including herself, further, though do keep in mind that we'll need to protect her as her hexproof does not actually apply to herself. Then this slot comes to a close with Armorcraft Judge and Ishai Ojatai Dragonspeaker. Armorcraft Judge is a 3/3 that, when it ETBs, draws us a card for every creature we control with a +1/+1 counter on it, making it a potent +1/+1 counter payoff in the form of card advantage. Ishai is a 1/1 flyer that gets a +1/+1 counter on it every time an opponent casts a spell, making it a potent ever-growing evasive threat that can inflict serious damage over time unless dealt with. Finally, reaching the CMC 5 slot, we have our last creature with Juniper Order Ranger, a 2/4 that, whenever another creature ETBs under our control, gives that creature and itself a +1/+1 counter, making it both itself and our creatures larger as we continue to summon them. That covers all our creatures, so let's move on to our instance. Skipping to the CMC 2 slot, we have a trio of counterspells with Counterspell, Arcane Denial, and Negate. The first countering anything, the second also countering anything but letting the spell's owner draw 2 while we draw 1 on the next upkeep, and the third countering only non-creature spells, all three providing potent disruptions for our opponent's plans while helping screen our board states against removal. We're also running Thassa's Intervention as our last 2-drop, an X spell that either lets us look at the top X cards of our deck, putting 2 of said cards into our hand while sending the rest to the bottom in a random order, or countering target spell unless its controller pays twice X, making it a good combination of disruption or card advantage depending on the situation. Moving on to the CMC 3 slot, we have a pair of removal spells with Beast Within and Generous Gift, both of which destroy a permanent at the cost of giving its controller a 3/3 to replace it, providing superb removal to deal with almost any type of permanent threat with minimal downside. Moving deeper into this slot, we have a pair of board wipe protection spells with Inspiring Call and Unbreakable Formation. Inspiring Call makes all our creatures with a +1/+1 counter on them indestructible until end of turn and draws us a card for each, protecting our pumped creatures and giving us card advantage in the process. Unbreakable Formation also makes all our creatures indestructible until end of turn, and, if cast on our main phase, puts a +1/+1 counter on each of them and grants them vigilance as well, serving as both a defensive or offensive option depending on what we need at the time. Hunter's Insight then closes out this slot, which has us choose a creature and then draws us cards equal to the amount of combat damage it deals to a player or planeswalker this turn, working well alongside our evasive creatures after they've been pumped for a significant amount of card advantage. Reaching the CMC 4 slot, we get to our last instant with Factor Fiction, which has us reveal the top 5 cards of our deck, then has an opponent sort them into 2 piles, one of which we'll be selecting to go to our hand and the other to our grave, giving us some decent card advantage at instant speed that will usually net us between 2 and 3 cards, and occasionally more if we can negotiate with our opponents. That covers all our instants, so let's move on to our sorceries. Skipping again to the CMC 2 slot, we have a pair of ramp spells with Rampant Growth and Farseek, both of which put a land from our deck into play tapped, the former doing so for basics while the latter hits non-forests with a basic land type, giving us some staple green land ramp that helps fix our mana curve nicely. The CMC 3 slot then gives us further ramp with Cultivate and Kodama's Reach, both searching our deck for 2 lands, putting one into play tapped and sending the other to our hand, again giving us some potent ramp to help outpace our opponents and get to all our colors. Moving along to the CMC4 slot, we have a single entry with Tezzeret's Gambit, which can cost 3 and 2 life thanks to its Phyrexian blue mana, draws us 2 cards, then proliferates, making it a decent source of card advantage that synergizes well with our +1/+1 counter game plan. Then we skip to the CMC6 slot and reach our last sorcery with Austere Command, which has us choose 2 of the following effects: destroy all artifacts, destroy all enchantments, destroy all creatures with CMC 3 or less, or destroy all creatures with CMC 4 or greater, making it a wipe that can dodge the majority of our small evasive flyers while scouring our opponent's biggest threats off the board in the process. That's it for our sorceries, so let's move on to our enchantments. Skipping to the CMC2 slot yet again, we have some counter distribution effects with Ordeal of Nylea, Ordeal of Thassa, and Durable Handicraft. Both ordeals are auras that give the enchanted creature a +1/+1 counter whenever it attacks, and upon reaching 3 or more counters, sack themselves for an effect. The former putting 2 basic lands from our deck into play tapped, and the latter drawing us 2 cards, each serving as an easy way to distribute +1/+1 counters to our creatures in the early game, then later providing us with ramp and card advantage respectively. Durable Handicraft lets us pay 1 when one of our creatures ETBs to put a +1/+1 counter on them, in addition to letting us pay 5 a green and sack it to put a +1/+1 counter on each of our creatures, giving us another cheap source of counter distribution in the early game and a one-time big source later when we don't need it anymore. Then we close out this slot with Kalani Heart Expedition, whose landfall trigger lets us put a charge counter on it for every land drop we make and lets us sack it when it has 3 or more to put 2 basic lands from our deck into play tapped, making it a decent source of ramp that works well with our other land ramp sources and our proliferation effects to come online even faster. Proceeding to the CMC3 slot, we have some more counter distribution effects and payoffs with Fall of the Imposter, Bread for the Hunt, and Hadana's Climb. Fall of the Imposter is a saga whose first and second chapter give a +1/+1 counter to up to 1 target creature, while its last chapter has target player exile the creature with the highest power they control, providing us with more counter distribution and serving as a non-targeting removal spell to deal with the biggest threat on the table after it's used up. Bread for the Hunt draws us a card whenever a creature we control with a +1/+1 counter on it deals combat damage to a player, making it a potent source of card advantage as our small counter-laden creatures slip past blockers and crash into our opponent's faces turn after turn. Hadana's Climb puts a +1/+1 counter on one of our creatures at the beginning of combat, then transforms into Winged Temple of Araska if that creature has 3+ counters on it, a land that taps for any color, and we can pay 1 a green, a blue, and tap it to give target creature flying and +X/+X, X being equal to its power until end of turn, pulling double duty as counter production early and a finisher later that doubles up our creature's power and even grants evasion, pairing particularly well with our commander in this case. Moving along to the CMC4 slot, we have even more counter distribution effects with Felidar Retreat and Citadel Siege. Felidar Retreat has landfall, either giving all our creatures a +1/+1 counter and vigilance until end of turn, or creating a 2/2 whenever a land ETBs under our control, which will usually be playing for the board-wide counter distribution as we make our land drops, but can be useful for establishing a board state when ours is lacking. Citadel Siege has us either choose Khans or Dragons when it ETBs. If Khans is chosen, at the start of combat on our turn, we put 2 +1/+1 counters on a creature we control, and if Dragons is chosen, we tap down a creature that belongs to the active player at the start of their combat, which will usually be playing for the Khan side for the extra counter distribution, but its Dragon side can still provide some decent slowdown for our opponent's combat phases if necessary. We then have some offensive card draw joining us with Coastal Piracy and Reconnaissance Mission, both of which have us draw a card whenever a creature we control deals combat damage to a player, the latter also having cycling for 2, giving us more card advantage sources to take advantage of our evasive bodies that will constantly be getting in for damage. Finally, reaching the CMC5 slot, we get to our last enchantment with Cathar's Crusade, which gives all our creatures a +1/+1 counter whenever a creature we control ETBs, making it a potent top end to constantly pump our board again and again as we continue to play our creatures. That covers all our enchantments, so let's move on to our artifacts. Our only artifact joins us in the CMC4 slot, that being Bident of Thassa, which draws us a card every time a creature we control deals combat damage to a player, and we can pay 1 a blue and tap it to force creatures our opponents control to attack if able, giving us yet another source of offensive card advantage, though this one can be used as a disruption tool to compel attacks if necessary. That covers our artifact, and since this build doesn't have any planeswalkers, let's move straight to our land base. Starting with our mana lands, we have Command Tower, which taps for any color in our commander's color identity, Canopy, Vista, and Prairie Stream, both of which come into play tapped unless we control 2 or more basic lands, tap for one of 2 of our colors, and count as a basic land type for the mana they would produce, Fortified Village, Port Town, and Vineglimmer Snarl, all which come into play tapped unless we reveal a basic land of the mana they would produce and tap for one of 2 of our colors, Yavimaya Coast, which taps either for a colorless or a blue or green if we take a damage, Seaside Citadel, which comes into play tapped and taps for any of our colors, and finally Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse, both which we can tap and sack to put a basic land from our deck into play tapped. For utility lands, we'll be running Gavany Township, Novision Heart of Progress, and Ghost Quarter. Gavany Township taps for a colorless and we can pay 2 a green, a white, and tap it to put a +1/+1 counter on each of our creatures, providing us with yet another counter distribution effect from the relative safety of a land slot. Novision Heart of Progress taps for a colorless and we can pay a green, a blue, and tap it to put a +1/+1 counter on each creature that ETB'd this turn, giving us a smaller window for distributing counters than the Township, but still being decent for the cost, and especially good if we can drop multiple small bodies all at once. Ghost Quarter taps for a colorless and we can tap it and sack it to destroy target land, giving its controller a basic from their deck to replace it, making it a decent source of spot removal for our opponent's utility lands. Lastly, we're running 6 plains, 7 islands, and 9 forests as our basics to fill out our land base. So now that we've covered all the cards in the deck, let's take a look at this deck's breakdown. This deck currently has 36 creatures including the commander, 10 instants, 6 sorceries, 12 enchantments, 1 artifact, no planeswalkers, and 35 lands. Looking at the stats that matter to our game plan, we have 26 sources of +1/+1 counter generation for themselves or others, 24 cards that are evasive or can grant evasion, 5 proliferation sources, 6 cards that care about +1/+1 counters, 7 cards that can provide individual or board-wide protection from removal or targeting, and 5 counter spells, giving us a significant number of evasive bodies along with the means to supply them with +1/+1 counters, alongside the means to generate even more counters or get extra utility out of them, and finally providing us with multiple ways to protect our board state by preventing our creatures from being targeted or destroyed, or even preventing spells that would do such things from resolving in the first place. For general deck stats, we have 8 ramp sources, 10 card draw sources, 9 targeted removal sources, and 1 board wipe. Our ramp targeted removal and board wipes being slightly lower than normal due to our low curve and interest in keeping our board state intact over disrupting our opponents, while our card draw remains at a fairly typical ratio. Looking at our mana curve, we have 10 1-drops, 20 2-drops, 17 3-drops, 14 4-drops, 2 5-drops, 1 6-drop, and 1 7-drop, giving us an extremely aggressive curve that focuses on establishing a board state quickly, then growing it and keeping it safe while it picks apart our opponent's life totals. Currently, this deck is valued at $65.97, not counting the price of basic lands or shipping. This price was calculated by using the cheapest listed marketplace price on TCG Player at the time of this recording. For side grades, some more sources of proliferation can certainly find a home here. Evolution Sage makes for a great source of it as we make our land drops and ramp, Contagion Clasp provides us with both removal and a mana sink for it, and Karn's Bastion can proliferate our counters from the relative safety of a land slot. Some higher CMC evasive bodies that are capable of generating their own counters could also warrant consideration if we want to beef up our mana curve. Sunscorched Regent gives us another ever-growing threat that even heals us as a bonus. Enduring Scale Lord can grow quickly out of control as we continuously put counters on our other creatures, and Roll Escape X Hybrid both distributes counters on ETB and proliferates on death for some more counter synergies. For upgrades, Hardened Scales, Pure Imaginative Rascal, and Branching Evolution all provide great sources of +1/+1 counter generation. The Ozolith helps us keep our counters even if our creatures are dealt with, and Heroic Intervention and Flawless Maneuver provide us with efficient and cost-effective ways to keep our board states intact. Finally, we have the usual suspects with Primal Vigor, the Great Henge, and Doubling Season, providing us with all the green +1/+1 counter production and synergies we want at the cost of all the green that we have in our wallets. Thanks everyone for sticking around until the end of the video. Firstly, I'd like to say thank you again to all my subs as we've cracked the 1200 sub milestone. Again, thank you for all your continued support in helping the channel grow. Taking a look at the results of last week's poll, it looks like it ended up in a dead heat between Asmodeus and Oswald. So making an executive decision, I decided to give it to Oswald and give Mono White a day to shine in the spotlight with an artifact pod style deck in next week's episode. Sorry, maybe next time, Asmodeus. Now pertaining to our usual poll, we'll be putting that on hold for a bit, as I'll be taking 2 weeks off in the beginning of September. partially for some R&R and partially to make some quality of life changes to the series and the channel, which I wouldn't have time for otherwise. So instead, I'd like to hear from you. How are you enjoying the Cut Rate Commander series, and what suggestions would you make to improve it? Would there be any other type of content you'd like to see on this channel, like higher budget builds, box openings, top 10 lists, or any other type of content? Also, would there be any interest in me starting a Patreon for Patreon-specific builds outside of Cut Rate Commander, or any other types of perks you folks would be interested in? Let me know the answers to those questions or anything else in the comments below. And with that, have a good one, folks, and stay safe.